Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Some of you didn't like the title of our first panel. Well, I hope you like the title of the second panel. Carbon offsetting, can you buy indulgence? And for this panel, we have with us today an excellent group of experts. We've got Myrto Tilianaki, who is a Climate Justice Advocacy Officer at CCFD-Terre Solidaire, an NGO. We've got Lénaïc Pineau, Group Chief Sustainability and Quality Officer at JCDecaux. We've got Vincent Loubinoux, Business Development Manager at ClimateSeed, provider of carbon offsets. And we've got Didier, who is an independent climate finance expert with many years of experience in carbon offsetting topics. So thank you all for being with us today. And before we begin our discussion about carbon offsetting, I just wanted to show you a couple of slides to set the scene for those in the room that may not be familiar with the concept of carbon offsetting. I just have 3 slides and I'll be extremely quick. Let's see if it works. Can we go to the next slide, please? My remote is not working. Oh, nope. Go back. I feel like there is a delay between the press of the button and change of the slide. Right, so the concept of carbon offsetting, I guess everyone has an idea of how it works, but basically just to look at this, the 2 sides of the game. So on the left-hand side, we've got the demand for offsets. So we've got a company who attempts to reduce its emissions, the orange area, and then there are some emissions remaining to be offset. And company can essentially buy carbon credits, carbon offsets, that would represent either avoided emissions or emissions stored or absorbed by a given project. And on the right-hand side, you've got 2 types of projects. So one example is a renewable energy offset project, which essentially avoids emissions by replacing fossil fuel power generation. And another example is a reforestation offset project, which essentially absorbs carbon from the atmosphere. And these are actually the 2 most popular types of offset projects. So already looking at this picture, I think we can see the 2 potential challenges with offsetting. The first challenge being on the demand side, to what extent carbon offsetting can really contribute to net zero, and to what extent it may be used sort of as an excuse to continue business as usual. So really where this, technology is really challenging, where this line should really be. And then on the supply side, of course, there is a question of how do we ensure the quality of carbon offsets? How do we ensure that each carbon credit really represents a real, measurable, and additional ton of CO2 emission reductions? Now, very quickly on the size of the market. So here you can see the size of the voluntary carbon market in megatons of CO2 equivalent. So as you can see, the system is out of control. Sorry about that. The market has been growing rapidly essentially after the adoption of the Paris Agreement. There are several factors driving this demand. Of course, the increasing number of net zero commitments by the companies. There's also demand coming from airlines under the CORSIA scheme that basically obliges airlines to offset additional growth of their emissions. And there's also demand from individuals like ourselves that are willing to offset their personal carbon footprints. You can also see different types of offsets traded on the voluntary carbon market. So the gray ones are red, which stands for reduced emissions essentially from deforestation and forest degradation. You've got the renewable energy projects and then all other project types. And in terms of value of the market, last year for the first time, the value of the market passed $1 billion, and it keeps growing really fast. And now, of course, my my last slide. These pictures are supposed to appear one by one. I don't know why they don't, but this is essentially to show you a couple of examples of criticism of carbon offsetting. There's a number of challenges, as I tried to outline, on the demand and the supply side of offsets. There's been some, well, rather outrageous claims like a net zero coal mine. There's been some companies that are trying to sell carbon neutral natural gas or oil. So this is sort of towards the question of how much you can really offset. And then, of course, all the questions related to the quality of offsets. There are different certification schemes, some of them better than others. And the last sort of point, which I think is also quite important, is the question of local impacts of offset projects. So there's been some cases where human rights violations were reported, or indigenous people's rights, especially regarding forestry projects. So this is another criticism. And I'm sure we're gonna, in our discussion, we're gonna touch upon some of these criticisms and how they can be addressed. And with that, to better structure the debate, I would suggest that we first spend maybe 30-40 minutes. We talk about sort of the demand side, to what extent carbon offsetting can contribute to net zero, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. And then in the second part, we will talk about the supply of offsets. So how do we ensure really the quality of carbon offset projects, and then we'll have another round of questions from the audience. All right, so with that, let me get back to you here, and let us maybe start with Lénaïc, since you are sort of on the demand side of carbon offsetting. JCDecaux committed to achieve net zero, and if I understand correctly, even announced net zero already as of maybe now in some countries. So could you tell us a few words about that, and how do you actually ensure that carbon offsetting does not substitute emission reductions in your own operations and your supply chains?
Well, thank you for this excellent question. And just to clarify, first, to be sure, our top priority is carbon reduction. We want to reduce our own emission, and since we have been doing that for a couple of years, now we are trying to do our part as well with some key projects to accelerate our positive impact on the environment. And as you said, we have launched a pilot in France, and we have already reached net zero for our French activities. So we are contributing aujourd'hui for scope 1, 2, and 3 for our carbon emission in the French market. And why have we made this decision? It's because sustainability has always been part of our DNA since the creation of the company. Meaning that JCDecaux, what we stand for, we have been creating some public services financed by advertising. So we want to be useful for brands, but mostly for the people, and to do that, taking care of the resources. This is one very important mission for us. And these historic commitments, maybe to illustrate it with two concrete facts. My department, the Sustainability and Quality Department, was created in 2007, and we have launched our first sustainability strategy in 2014. And with all these commitments, we have already succeeded to reach some concrete reduction performances. Like, for instance, we have reduced by half in 10 years our fleet consumption by using the best car we could, by investing in eco driving and optimizing all our fleet. But we have also 100% of our energy which is renewable since 2019 in our French activities, and it will be the case at the group level for our 80 countries in 2022. And we have also 70% of our waste which is recycled. So based on all these historical commitments, we said this is not enough. Okay, we have been doing a lot for scope 1 and 2. We have been reducing by half our carbon emission since 2017 for France on scope 1 and 2, but this is still enough. Our target now is to work on scope 3, but this is a long work, as was said previously, because you have to work with all your value chain to do so. So this means that we can't wait, because we are facing a climate emergency, and we have to seize all the opportunities to do our part as of today. So that's why we have decided to contribute in France. And it's a pilot for the group that I will extend the climate strategy at the group level, and we will see what will be the pace to reach carbon neutrality at the group level. But it was very important for us to do that already in France, to learn, because it's a long road. And as you said, we can do a lot of mistakes. And by doing that with the small countries, we learn a lot. And how do I assure that at the end, offsetting is not more important than carbon reduction? Well, simple. First of all, the governance. I think the governance is key. You need internal control and the proper governance to do so. That's why we have 2 control bodies that will review our climate strategy to be sure that we are on the good track. Secondly, internal control is not enough. That's why we have decided to base our climate strategy, which will be aligned with 1.5 trajectory, but also we will follow international standards such as SBTi, where carbon reduction is key and central. And last but not least, you need to deploy it within your organization, and to do that, our variable remuneration of our top executive management has embedded some criteria, some sustainability criteria, including climate reduction, carbon emission reductions. So I think really to be sure that offsetting is not your top priority, you need to build a holistic approach, embedding both carbon reduction and offsetting, and to deploy it properly into your organization.
Thank you, Lénaïc. Christian, same question to you. You have a lot of experience purchasing essentially carbon offsets. How do we ensure that offsetting doesn't, replace action in the company?
Thank you. I think actually I can't agree more with what has just been said, because if you look at companies taking commitments, they take commitments to be obviously in line with the Paris Agreement, and they take a commitment based on science. If you look at the impacts of the Science-Based Target Initiative, of the 1.5 degree roadmap, it is sectorial, it is driven by science, it is number, it is percentages, and as you've just mentioned, it is also a 3-step trajectory where companies need first to reduce their own emissions, then make sure they act in their extended supply chain to maximize sequestration of carbon. For example, if you work in the food industry, you will have a very strong focus on land use and on carbon sequestration potential in soils, and then only you can address offsets of what's remaining in your overall scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So for me, it's really a sequential process where you have a first priority on redesigning, upgrading, changing your business model before you actually measure the actions and address what is left. What are the consequences of that? Companies are making plans, they are building strategies, more or less mature, more or less advanced, depending on their sector, depending on their appetite for adjusting their business model. And these plans, and I'm sorry, I will be the first one to talk about money today, these plans are extremely expensive. If you look at the transformation plans of Nestlé or Unilever in fast-moving consumer goods, we speak about 1 to 2 billion euros impact, one-off or recurring, of such business plans. So it's a significant change, a significant impact in company value. And as soon as you speak of company value, you speak about investors. And if you look today at the requests from investors, I have in mind, for example, the Climate Action 100+ group of investors. They are extremely demanding on assessing the impact and the impact on cash flows of the transition plans, and they are starting to ask for what is coming next in terms of offsets. So I think it's also a second areas of interest for investors. Regulators, like for example, the AMF in France, has asked the company to disclose in details at the end of last year for the first time their transition plans. So you see there is more and more pressure on companies to make sure that there is a robust plan to transition to a low carbon economy. Why is it more interesting or more important now than a few years ago? I think it's because companies are starting to link the trajectory they want to have to products, to brands, and to claims. If you look at the fast-moving consumer good industry, there is obviously a corporate development. There are leaders in their fields, such as Danone, such as Schneider Electric, who want to be extremely involved because they have a belief in their reason to be. They have become entreprise à mission, which is a very specific legal status in France. So there is a strategy, there is a vision. But the very first time you address consumers in their daily life, the very first time you allow consumers to make a choice between a low carbon or high carbon product, or low carbon or high carbon brand, is when you actually become carbon neutral on a brand, on a product. And this is the reason why offsets become, I would say, a key lever to achieve this, is because at a brand level, which speaks to consumer, companies have been able to reduce their footprints, to maximize carbon sequestration, and finally, to offset their emissions, to be able to access the claim. And if I want to link to what was said yesterday about the tragedy of horizons, I think it's very interesting to notice that offsets also allow companies to act now in a reasonable horizon. When you are on a 10, 15, 20, 50-year horizon, it's a strategic horizon companies usually never face in their business cycles. Strategic planning is usually on 3 to 5 years. So carbon offsets allow, in the short term, to be able to act directly on carbon neutrality. Another example of the trend which supports as well the higher quality or higher scrutiny on offset market is the one on regulation. If you had a look at the CSRD first draft, so the new law which will give a framework to companies for reporting their performance and sustainability in Europe, it was issued a few weeks ago, and I took part in writing this document. There is a whole chapter on offsets, which means that there is, for the first time, a request from the regulation to corporates to mention how much they offset, at what price, coming from which countries, and which type of projects. And I think it's a very interesting move, because regulation could have said, we let this to competition, we leave this to a liberal market, and actually the regulator is much more interested than before to understand what's happening there. And I invite you to attend the webinar organized by the Minister of Finance, the French Minister of Finance, on Thursday, where this exact topic will be explained. Another example, specific to France again, so sorry for that. Regulation is under preparation for a few weeks. It is now under draft consultation to regulate the carbon neutrality claims on fast-moving consumer goods. So from next year, when companies will claim for carbon neutrality on a product, it means that they would have had to first reduce, explain how they measured their reductions, explain the investment they did, and finally explain which offsets they used. So again, one more example of a push to regulation. And to conclude on one third example, again, it's a market. So what maybe not mentioned is that yes, there is supply, there is demand. So it's all the characteristics of the market. It was in 2021 bigger than ever. It grew bigger than $1 billion overall. So it started to be significant. So it's something which is visible in the comparing radar. It's 4 times bigger in volume than the years before. There is a very strong increase in prices, a very strong increase in volatility, and companies get exposed. So companies get exposed to a market, which is something they know. Look at the cost of raw materials, look at the cost of energy in the last months. So now they can be exposed also to a cost of offsets, which is not the same today as it was when they set their science-based target, just because the market has changed. So it's also very challenging for companies. and shareholders, investors are more demanding. Conclusion again on value. I invite you to do a very easy exercise, which is to take the carbon footprint of the CAC 40 companies, so the companies which are on Paris Stock Exchange, look at their full scope emissions, and imagine that one day the carbon offset market is around 100 euros per ton. It was one of the values mentioned yesterday. Today, let's say we are more between 5 and 50, but we see a very good trend for increase. The majority of companies, if they were to offset tomorrow their emissions, would have no more net results, which means it would be totally destroying shareholder value if companies were only focusing on offsets. And for me, that's a very good example that companies need to first work on reducing their emissions, and then only, as a sequence, but in the right way, with the right quality of standards, with the right approach, with the right social impact, and I think we will discuss it a bit later in the panel. But it's only coming next. I would say it's only the consequence of action plans which have been transforming the company in depth.
Thank you, Christian. Vincent, over to you. You are one of the providers of carbon offsets, essentially. How do you make sure that you avoid a potential conflict of interest of, your business is based on you want to sell more carbon offsets, but how do you make sure that you also help companies reduce their own emissions?
That's a very good question. Thank you. First, at ClimateSeed, we are not only proposing carbon offsetting. We really want to work with companies to help them calculate their carbon emissions, and we have 4 experts in the team that are actually assessing the carbon footprint of companies. We are also, of course, helping them to decarbonize within their own value chain with reduction strategies. And at the end, we are proposing, in fact, offsetting and like project developers that are able to capture or avoid carbon emissions with their projects. So that's the first thing, and I think now most of the companies that are proposing carbon offsetting, they are also proposing the 2 first layers of the strategy. At ClimateSeed, we do not want to work with some sectors of activities. So we do not want to work with armament. We are not working with tobacco, and we do not want to have any clients related to big oil and gas companies.
What about coal?
Coal as well, oil and gas and coal. We're not working with these kind of companies. Another thing that is, I think, very interesting at ClimateSeed is that we want to work with companies to help them communicate on their actions. So when they actually buy carbon offsets through the platform we built, we help them communicate on their carbon offsetting strategy, and we don't want them, and we advise them not to talk about carbon neutrality for themselves, but more, and César would agree with that, to contribute to global carbon neutrality. Because I think that the latest scientific findings say that we can contribute to carbon neutrality with a budget, but we cannot actually subtract the emissions of your carbon footprint with the emission that you have offset in the end. So I think that the communication part of ClimateSeed is very important. We really want the companies to actually claim real scientific findings and be related with the latest scientific findings. Another thing is maybe some actors that are only proposing carbon offset have a conflict of interest. I'm thinking about carbon trading platforms where on those platforms, you do not see the projects, you do not see the co-benefits, you do not see the impacts of the SDGs of the projects. And actors can go on the platform, just buy offset, and then wait for the price to go up, and then resell the carbon credits right away. At ClimateSeed, we do not accept secondary market on the platform. So whenever a company goes on the ClimateSeed platform, they can buy offset, but it's only for the own offsetting purposes. So if they want to speculate on the price and then resell the same carbon credits to a third party, this is not possible because they sign our terms and conditions, and our terms and conditions refuse for them to do so. So this is very important. I think the conflict of interest is for the companies that are only proposing carbon offsetting, where you don't see the projects. Often the carbon credits are low priced, so that's not a good signal for the company to decarbonize, and then they can then resell the carbon credits right away, only for speculation purposes.
Does it mean that the credits are being retired immediately, essentially, after they're purchased on your platform?
That's a very good question as well, thanks. So on the ClimateSeed platform, clients can either retire the credits immediately, or they can stock part of the credits for later use, but they can only use the credits for themselves and not resell the carbon credits to a third party. So if a company wants to anticipate, let's say, its offsetting needs for 2021, 2022, 2023, it can contribute to the project directly today, and then use the retirements in 2021, 2022, and 2023, but only for its own offsetting.
Got it.
Thanks.
Thank you. Well, last but not the least, Myrto. You are part of the NGO community that's been quite critical about carbon offsetting over the past years. Back to the question of our panel. Do you think companies are just buying indulgence?
Thank you for your question, and I'm really happy to be joining this discussion today, and quite encouraged by what has been said by fellow panelists on, the importance of reducing before offsetting. However, today the trend that we notice the most in terms of corporate carbon neutrality claims is that there are very little emissions reductions and a heavy reliance on offsetting to reach these net zero goals. So that is a very worrying trend. And so in that sense, offsetting, when applied like that, delays urgent climate action and concrete decarbonization measures, and becomes a communications tool for companies that don't curb their emissions sufficiently, thus exposing them also to potential litigation risks. And this is something that we're seeing a lot in Europe at the moment. Cases against Shell in the Netherlands claiming to be carbon neutral while relying heavily on offsetting. And when I say relying heavily, it means that Shell, in order to reach its net zero goals, had to offset 3 times the size of the Netherlands to reach its goals. So we have other cases in Europe as well. But for me, the main issue as well is, looking at the science, it's not just civil society. The IPCC has said recently, last April actually, in its mitigation report, that what is needed is drastic, deep emissions cuts and a transformation across all sectors. And unfortunately for me, offsetting doesn't address either those priorities. So the reduction priority and the transformation priority. In terms of reductions, I just want to highlight that reducing and removing CO2 are very different notions and very different terms. So there is nothing more sure for the climate than emissions reductions. Removals are very uncertain, especially when they go through land-based offsets, land-based projects. For instance, when you emit a ton of CO2 in the atmosphere, it will stay there for about a century. However, when you will plant a forest that is meant to store your carbon permanently, you will have to be able to guarantee that CO2 will stay absorbed for about 100 years. And that is highly uncertain. Forest-based offsets are highly reversible. Look at the state of the forest today. We're seeing the Brazilian Amazon, a former carbon sink, is becoming a source of carbon. So this heavy reliance on land-based offsets is highly problematic, is putting a lot of pressure on land. And yeah, sorry, just to wrap up because there's so much to say. Bringing it back to what was discussed in the previous discussion, the New Climate Institute report. I don't know if all of you were here before, but basically a think tank, German-based think tank, looking at 25 corporate net zero pledges and noticing that most of them lack integrity and rely heavily on offsets. And my NGO, the NGO I work for, we worked on a report looking at 3 French multinational corporations from the most emitting sectors, well, Total Energy, Nespresso and Air France, 3 companies that claim to be carbon neutral, but do very little to reduce their emissions and rely heavily on dodgy offsetting projects. So it is a very worrying trend. I'm encouraged to hear from fellow panel speakers that this, priority that has to be given towards reductions is on your agenda. But unfortunately, what we're seeing today as a trend is that that is not the case. So I hope that this will shift more quickly.
Thank you, Myrto. We're going to get back to the question of dodgy offsets in the second part of our discussion. Now, I suggest that we open the floor for a couple of questions from the audience. Do we have any questions? Yes, first, and then second there in the back, and then the third in the middle. We'll take these 3 questions for now.
Hi. Quick question, because a study of the BCG shows that we need to multiply by 6 the investment in decarbonized technology to reach 1.5 targets. And I believe carbon offsetting could be a great way to finance this transition. And since the beginning, and it's always the case with carbon offsetting conference, it's only about dodgy carbon offsetting, indulgence, right to pollute, and greenwashing. When do we change this speech and just say carbon offsetting, a great opportunity to finance the crucial transition we need? And I believe the debate is more about what is a good carbon offset, and let's push this good carbon offset rather than always say it's an indulgence, because when Lénaïc Pineau is saying she's offsetting all the scope 1, 2, and 3 emission, which is great, she has to justify herself. And when Plastic Omnium say, 500,000 tons, and it's nothing, and it would be useless to buy carbon offset, everybody applauds, and I think this is just a nonsense.
Thank you very much. Who wants to take this?
I can start answering, and then you can obviously join in. Thank you for your question. It's a really good one. What I think most of the criticism is about today is not just the exceptionally and rare dodgy projects. Actually, there's a lot of literature in the past about a lot of projects that have been harmful, but the main issue today is what I mentioned in the beginning. If we were following today the avoid, reduce, compensate logic on paper, we would not be having this discussion. It is this over-reliance on offsetting and the lack of actual measures that is bringing us to this type of debate today. So if we were to be following that triptyque, as we say in French, then things would be much better. And in addition to that, the state of voluntary carbon markets today is not great. There is a big quality problem, a big credibility problem, and that's not just NGOs saying that. There has been analysis coming in month after month saying that there is a lack of integrity. So unless we address this highly unregulated space and bring more credibility to the types of programs and credits that are being used, sold, traded, etc., then we will still be having these discussions. So it's not just about the example of a single project or a single credit. It is a more systemic issue today that needs to be addressed.
And if I may complete, I think it would be great if we had the opportunity to wait and first to work only on reduction action. Because to be honest, that was what I thought before. I thought we have to focus only on reduction because this is where we have the most impact. But to be honest, we can't wait anymore. So I agree with you, we have definitely to use all the tools we can to improve our impacts, our company impacts, but also to help others to switch and to switch their habits, to find the great solutions that we all need, and to work on all the countries we are operating. And to be honest, when we have done so much in scope 1 and 2, and you are looking at your scope 3, yes, we have some options, we have some possibilities to reduce scope 3, but it's a long way. It's a very long way and we can't wait. That's why we have decided to do that at JCDecaux and to start in France, because obviously it has a strong financial impact, and we don't want to compensate all our emissions right now because it's nonsense. We still need a financial cash flows to also work on our reduction emissions. But for instance, for the fleet vehicles, we know that we would like to switch directly to electric ones. Well, it's not maybe the best option, but so far, this is one of the best in the market. So we wanted to do that in France because from the environmental point of view, it might sound like the best option we have. But if you look at the social impact, it's not the case. Why? Because our employees use the cars to do the maintenance of our street furniture and then go back home with their cars. And if we switch to electric cars, this is an issue because the people we have, they don't have access to electric bonds. They are not living in some houses where they can fulfill their car. So this is really an issue. So that means that, okay, we have the technology, but we have also to take care of the social impacts and to work on a bigger plan to make it happen. So that's why when you have to work on your carbon emission reduction, this is important, but you can at the same time compensate, offset with the right providers and to be sure that you are really doing a good job with that. But this is a big question and you can't focus only on the environmental impact of your decision.
I actually agree with you. We will not reach carbon neutrality without contribution from the private sector to create new carbon sinks, to finance new technologies that are able to avoid carbon emissions. So I think the main part of your question is we should change the wording. We shouldn't speak about offsetting, we shouldn't net the emission of the company with the emission that are offset. We should just speak with the companies, assess what are their budget to decarbonize outside their value chain, and choose with them the best and high quality carbon offset that will be permanent and that will have a real impact to avoid or capture emissions. And this can be done through new technologies, you are right, and I know the BCG report that you stated.
And maybe two last points to your question. If you look today at the competitive landscape of companies, they are in front of very big challenges. As you just mentioned, they don't have time anymore. If you look at the food industry, the food system we are in is not sustainable, which means that each time a company is buying €1 of raw material, there is roughly €1 equivalent negative impact for society. This is this kind of range or order of magnitude. So companies are in front of consumers who are choosing one product or the other. They're in front of regulators who are asking for more transparency, who are ready maybe one day to tax emissions. And they are in front of I would say, risks, which are systemic risks in their ecosystem, in their supply chain, which they have to face. So they have no other option but making of both their reduction and their offsets a competitive advantage just because they want to be still there in 3 or 5 years. And another very maybe financial-based answer based on what has just been said, we are on a market, the carbon offsets, which is booming in terms of volume, in terms of value, which means that it's a market which is being structured as well, which is getting more mature. What happens to markets which get more mature? They also attract financial flows on more qualitative projects, on more qualitative offers, on more differentiating offers. So I think that the phase we are going through, where there is a rush for qualitative carbon credits for good reasons, is a good phase because it will allow to see the emergence of more innovations. Look at the carbon capture in air, which has occurred recently in the north of Europe, where initially the technology was around 10,000 euros per ton. Now we are reaching the 1,000 euros per ton. I think that attracting financial flows to innovation on this market will allow it to be more structured and more positive so that we stop speaking about greenwashing, but that we start speaking about return on emission for brands and for, at the end, the collective benefits.
Thank you. I see that many people don't like titles of the panels that that I put up, but I think that's actually a good thing. That means that we generate a debate. If the title was carbon offsetting, great thing, we would probably have an empty room here. But now, on a more serious note, maybe just one point to mention. I do think that we have some systemic issues with some of the offsets. There's been a lot of studies, for example, on the clean development mechanism offsets back in the Kyoto days that demonstrated that a lot of projects, and I'm talking about a large share of projects, were essentially non-additional. Non-additional, that means that projects would have happened anyway without selling carbon credits, right? So that means that the revenues coming from the sale of carbon credits are just an icing on the cake, in the financial plan of a project, but it would have happened anyway. So you cannot really claim that you are offsetting your emissions, by purchasing this type of carbon credits. And I think here the communication aspect is very important. And coming back to the discussion we had about the contribution rather than offsetting. So I think we have to really keep this in mind. Now with that, I think there was a question in the back first and in the middle.
So my question is probably going to direct to Ms. Pineau at JCDecaux, because I used to work in the industry. As you said, on the scope 3, there's a lot of challenges, and I'm sure there's a lot of conversations being had within the group. So my question is, if you look at JCDecaux as a brand and business model, a lot of its advertising is based on transportation, right? So, which are a lot of the biggest emitters and polluters nowadays. So would you consider at the larger scale saying, okay, in the future, if the buses are not electric or it's not renewable energy, we're not going to publish this on those buses. Same goes with trains and same goes with airports. So like, how do you address as the nature of transportation business model on the climate change as an advertising company? Thank you.
Well, thank you for this question. It's very interesting, and you're right. At the end, you have to think and see how you can embed sustainability into all your decisions and how can it influence your business model. And I think what is interesting to see is that with the green taxonomy, you have already a great framework to assess how sustainable is your business model. Because thanks to the green taxonomy, we can say at JCDecaux that we have more than 30% of our revenue which is aligned to the green taxonomy, which means that 30% of our revenues contribute to the transition according again to the framework which was designed. So I think it's important to see how our services in the future can contribute, accelerate the transitions. For instance, we are doing also some bikes. As you may know, we were operating the contract in Paris, but we are doing so as well in many other countries. And for sure, it's very important for us to see how we are associating our business to some greener transports. And we are also present in airports. As you know, today it's a difficult industry to decarbonize, but we are working very closely with these partners to find the solution. I think it's easy to say, no, I won't work with you, you're not green enough. This is not the right position. I think you have to work with them to find together the solution. And that's why we are working with all the airports we are operating in to find the solution. And they are working, for instance, in modality transport, meaning how to make it a greener hub, meaning that embedding other kind of transportation. Is it enough? I don't know, but I want to be part of the solution. I want to help them and to see how we can find solutions together, because at the end, it's still a need today that may evolve, and we have to work together to find a suitable business model for them, for us, and to work together. So it's tough, and it's long-term decision, I would say.
Question here. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Colombian Brazilian, and we'll go back to the point that Myrto remarked some minutes before about deforestation. Rates of deforestation are very worrying for me, and I think that we cannot say that we are offsetting, because deforestation is even bigger than when we plant trees. Therefore, my question is to Vincent. What do you think about this? Like, we could say for companies that they are offsetting if our baseline was that all the trees of the Amazon or wherever we plant trees were not going down. But if we are going down more than what we are planting trees or whatever, we cannot say that companies are really offsetting, really?
There are standards on the voluntary carbon market. The two main standards are gold standard and VCS, Verified Carbon Standard, and to allocate carbon credits to projects that preserve forest, they need to assess the baseline scenario and the project scenario. The baseline scenario is the scenario that would happen without the implementation of the project. So the standards actually calculates the carbon, the carbon leakage, let's say, that would happen if nothing is done. So it's sort of a deforestation factor. And it's only if there is a deforestation factor, then they assess a project scenario where they preserve the land, and they actually then allocate carbon credits for the land that is preserved and the carbon that is stored in the ground. So the difference between the baseline scenario and the project scenario gives the right to sell carbon credits on the market to companies that want to contribute to preserving some land. So here we need to make sure that the baseline scenario and the deforestation factors of the lands that are assessed by the standards are rightly calculated. To do so at ClimateSeed, we have a sustainability committee of 4 carbon experts that actually assess the baseline scenario of those kind of projects. And often, 3 times in 4 years, we have actually rejected projects on the ClimateSeed platform because actually the baseline scenario was not well calculated, and the land that were actually preserved was not at risk of deforestation. So that's the way it works at ClimateSeed. And yes, even for projects that are certified by Gold Standard VCS, we need a double check to make sure that the project scenario and the baseline scenario are well calculated.
Vincent, maybe just a quick follow-up. Do you think there may be some sort of a perverse incentive if indeed we have billions flowing, for example, in carbon offsets in Brazil? And essentially this creates a perverse incentive for the government in Brazil not to put in place regulations, which they probably should, regulating deforestation. Do you think there is an issue, or is this something,
Unfortunately, right now, the government in Brazil will not apply any regulation to stop deforestation. So the contribution of the private sector to preserve those land in Brazil, I think, is needed right now. If the governments change, and I think the election in Brazil are this year, if I'm right, probably there could be a conflict of interest. You're right.
Myrto, you wanted to add something?
Really quickly, yes, I agree. The question is quite relevant. Actually, we've had examples in the past of Vera VCS projects or other certifications approving the business as usual scenario, the baseline scenario that was really close to a business as usual one. And so we've had projects in the past where emissions have been rising and they still generate credits that are traded. So indeed, the double check, is a really good idea.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Igor, for the title. Again, I don't like it, But
I knew that.
if that's a question, I would say carbon offsetting. Do we need carbon offsetting as a complementary tool, as a complementarity solution? The answer is yes, obviously. Now I wanted to say that I read carefully the GIEC report, and we all know that there is an urgency to act. That means that we have not to wait a sequential sequence of action like measure, reduce, and compensate. We have to take all the solutions at the same stage and use them straight now to reach kind of, I know that people don't like this term, some of them don't like, carbon neutrality, just to act urgently to tackle climate change. So that was the first point I would like to have your comment on that. And now a second point I wanted to raise is I'm reluctant to behave like a moralizer or like an ethic knight regarding what shall be done or not, with whom I'm able to work or not. That's just a comment to what has been said by Vincent. We've got lots of field we decide not to work with, like oil, let's say tobacco, but every company's got its shadow side. And if we have an exhaustive list of what are all the companies with whom we don't have to work, if we decide to act so, we can include also fiscal paradises. And then we'll have a lot of companies, including all the banks, with whom it would be not legitimate to work. So who is really legitimate to work with whom? So I ask the question.
Sure. Yeah, go ahead, address the first bit. And then
Sorry, just to address the first bit of your remark, absolutely agree that everything has to be happening simultaneously. The only issue is that when by simultaneously the reductions are not there, and so offsetting serves as a lever to not, curb the emissions as asked for by the IPCC or the EU Fit for 55 goals, for instance, then that is a problem. So there is no issue in saying that we need to accelerate ecosystem restoration projects, but when these efforts, these offsetting efforts, come in the expense of the actual emissions reductions that, as I mentioned before, are scientifically proven to be the most effective way to, maintain global warming to 1.5, then yeah, that is the main issue in that logic.
I agree. So we do not work with companies that have no plan to reduce, and so some of the actors in the oil and gas sector have actually no plan to reduce and are using actually the carbon offsetting lever just to avoid reducing their own emissions in their own value chain. So those kind of companies, we do not tend to work with them. And on the company side, we also do an analysis because we were launched actually by a subsidiary of BNP Paribas at the beginning. Now the company was bought by AXA. And so we have to comply with the banking rules. And so we did a KYC, a Know Your Customer analysis on all the companies that want to join the ClimateSeed platform. So either for the project carriers, but also for the companies, we did KYC analysis to make sure that there is no money laundering risks, that there were no, let's say, companies created in tax haven or other things. So actually those reputational and financial risk we also assess.
Thank you for your interventions, first of all. I want to maybe to raise a little bit different perspective. I guess strategically we're making a small error by treating companies like governments. So the point is that companies, so initially we were created to gain profit, right? So, and we are not in the same situation as the governments and can conduct changes because they have a stable income as taxes. So in companies we have like profit, market share, market capitalization and strategic. And I guess one of the reasons why so companies, especially like Shell, really pull on offsetting because, so on the one hand, we need to, to introduce some changes. because otherwise we have PR issues. We have issues with new people because it's complicated for Total or other companies to attract new students and new talents because they don't want to work in industries that pollute. But at the same time, I think it's not really fair to compare them to different industries because it's cool when you Hennessy and you can use sailing boats to transfer your cognac because you are part of a great group and you can easily control your market share. But when you Shell or when you Total, for you it's not so obvious to make those deep transformations in a short term to become greener. But you need to do it, otherwise you will lose your market share. You won't be able to attract other, investors and others. So I guess they use offsetting in order to try to mitigate this in a short term because it's impossible for them, I guess, to make it fast. So, and on the other hand, there are NGOs like yours that simply, just not bullying, but tapping them to make faster. And I guess this creates a little bit of situations when companies simply especially from petrol or nautic spheres, they can't do it fast. They stop, going offsetting because they can transform in short term. And on the other hand, there was public sectors that are trying to pull in them to transform, and there was this décalage, as we say. So there was a gap between those companies that becomes deeper and deeper because both sides kind of become, kind of polarization, I guess. Don't you think it happens like this? Because it seems for me.
Yeah, I absolutely agree on the point that it's not on companies to put in place these transformative public policies that will accompany the transition. So indeed, I think there is a big challenge here to create legal frameworks and more regulation from states, definitely, to better encompass all these mechanisms. And I understand what you're saying, but as international climate NGOs, we strive to get involved in international climate negotiations. So that's what we're trying to achieve at UN level, so at COPs, regarding the Paris Agreement negotiations. That's what we're trying to do at EU level or even at national level. So the NGO I represent today, and my work is mostly about that, indeed, to create more state incentive, to create stricter, more robust public policy frameworks that will not allow these types of loopholes or this type of completely free interpretation of what net zero is. So yeah, absolutely agree on that.
If I may maybe add a point on what was said, I agree obviously that companies are not governments. Nevertheless, companies are not also isolated either. I mean that companies are part of an ecosystem which means that they have to solve tensions. They have to solve tensions between suppliers and consumers. They have to solve tensions between shareholders and internal investment. They have to solve tensions between competitors and regulators. So at the end, the job of companies is to make decisions on where they want to go. If you look at the world 5 years ago and the world in 5 years, it will be very different. And companies will have had a role to play in this area. So they will make the choices to survive, to develop, to grow. And at the end, each time you spend money on whatever you buy as a product or a service, you are making a choice also for the world you want to live in. If you buy an electric car on a thermic car, you are making a choice. If you buy a dairy product or a plant-based product, you're making a choice. So I'm a strong believer of the fact that more information from consumers, coming from NGOs, coming from very different stakeholders, will allow consumers to be better informed, and regulation also helps to standardize, to allow comparability between different offers. And then each of us will have a role to play to convert its own money, its own assets, its own working power into products or services which will make a difference and which will bring a very different world. And I think it's very good to have this in mind, because it means that as a citizen, as an employee in a company, we have different roles, but at the end, if we speak of convergence between financial and extra-financials, when we make choices in a company or individually, we also decide where we want to go.
I think there was a question, sir, there.
Thanks to all the panelists for the interesting conversation. I have a question for Madame Pineau, maybe also for the other panelists that they have inside. You mentioned about your top management of your company being incentivized on climate items. Can you expand on this, about what you learned, what worked, what didn't, and eventually if other panelists have similar experiences? Thank you.
Well, thank you for this question, and it raises an important challenge. It's about governance, because I think if you want to have an impactful climate strategy, you need to build the proper governance and with the proper tool to deploy all around your companies, your strategy. We are operating in 80 countries. We have more than 10,000 people across the world, so we need to really animate this community of employees to work together to reach our targets. So we have decided a little bit less than 10 years to embed sustainability criteria in the variable remuneration of our top management. At the beginning, it was 10%, and in 2022, we will increase it by 15%. And every year, we are defining with the board members which kind of criteria we want to set up for the countries every year. And among them, we have health and safety, because the security of our employees is key, but we have also environmental criteria. And depending of the maturity of every aspect, we have different kind of criteria. For instance, this year, we want to reach 100% of our energy consumption, which will be green. So this is one of the criteria, because we want to reach this. But we have also a more qualitative approach, and we want each country to seize this challenge and to have the opportunity to make their own answer and really to work on them on a local base. So that's why we want them to build their own plan based on the corporate view and corporate targets and corporate guidelines. But at the end, you also need every countries and every managing directors with their CODIR, their management executive committee, to work on this aspect. So I think it's very important to put some sustainability criteria into their variable remuneration, because it's one leverage to really be sure that sustainability is at the agenda as a top priority for every managing director. And this is a good way to also help them to embed sustainability into every decision, business decision they made. So that's why we have been doing that. And to be honest, this year we have also deployed this process to corporate directors and corporate managers, and I can really see how people are always talking about sustainability, thinking about climate action, and how in every decision it can have an impact. Because at the end, I don't think it's really a question of motivation, but it's a kind of reminder. It's really how you can be sure that they are really thinking every day about climate strategy. So I think it's working, and I hope there will have more testimony to explain how we can better embed sustainability into governance and into variable remuneration, because I think it's key.
Hi.
Just a remark on your question. I find it very encouraging that most of the company now are answering a questionnaire called CDP, Carbon Disclosure Project, and within the questionnaire there is a question about the governance, and if you actually give variable remuneration to your CEO, you get a greater mark in the questionnaire. So this kind of new ways to encourage and engage the CEOs to have a better climate strategy is also seen in this kind of questionnaire, which is very nice.
I think you exactly mentioned what I was about to say. And you can't be A anymore in the CDP, so you can't be part of the top 1% companies in the world if you don't have a strategy of remuneration at different levels of the organization to incentivize people. And just to close the loop, I think that obviously there is a genuine interest from companies to act, so to measure upon what is done and how far the progress is achieved. But there's also a pressure from investors, because investors want to make the right choices when allocating their assets, and they want to bet on the companies they think will win within their investment horizon, 3, 5, 10 years, depending on businesses. So they also push to incentivize management to make the right decisions, either on cash, on turnover, on market share, whatever, but also on all the sustainability topics. Carbon is the easiest one because the measurements are very clear, but we also see a trend to have more water, biodiversity, plastic, circularity topics in executive management bonuses to make sure that they actually deliver the roadmap agreed with the investors.
We've got a question in the middle, and then the lady, and then the sir.
Hi, thank you for, I'm here. My question is for Madame Pineau. Can you please elaborate on the impact of the incentives on the strategy of a company? For example, when you have to choose between a normal OOH device versus a digital one, and the fact that some digital device are, light on all nights. So what is the real impact, and how do you assess that versus the profitability that can be the main driver for the rest of the managers?
Well, thank you for this question, because this is my everyday challenge, I would say. This is all about eco-design, and how from the beginning, when you are developing a product or services, you are sure that you are taking the right decision to have the best environmental impact. But it's not only about the environmental impact, as you said, because we have also other key criteria, such as costs, such as quality, such as the durability of our assets. So what we have done is that we have built a co-design policy based on 10 easy principles, which are applied by our R&D department. And we have listed the 10 main actions you have to take into consideration when you are developing a new furniture. And this is exactly what you were saying. So the size of the screen, but also the energy consumption of the screen, and the quality of the light, and everything. So we have been doing that. And it's still not enough, so that's why we have launched our new 2030 strategy this year, and we are releasing a press release on the coming days about that. And that's why we want to really systematize eco-design, because this is great to have a policy, but you need to go further and to be sure you have the right tool and the right training for all your R&D team to better understand all these elements. And the 10 principles are easy and are good, but the world is moving, the issues are changing, the expectations are higher and higher, so that's why we have also to refine our way to assess the environmental and social footprint of our furnitures, and that's why we want to really rethink it and systematize it, and to be sure that every furniture that we will launch, we will have first the assessment, so that we can take a better decision and take into account the environmental impact as another criteria, such as price, cost, and quality. So it's an overall decision that you have to make, and also you have to take into account what your competitors are doing, because we are standing for high quality furniture, but many other peers are doing the same, but we have also some new players on the market who don't have the same standards of quality, and who are really crushing the prices. So it's a tough decision at the end, and you need to have the proper tool to take the decision a holistic decision, I would say.
Hello, thank you for this amazing discussion. First of all, I have a set of financial questions, but I would like to ask a more philosophical one. And I would like to make some bridge between our previous discussion and this one. So we talk about strategy and we talk about offsetting. And my question lies in our basic principles. To be successful in strategy and in transformation, we know it's very important to start with clear basic principles. And my question for all of us, when we decided that we have a lot of time to restrict, to offset, to have a lot of time to go through all specific business models, etc. Why I ask about this? Because I remember about our economical past, and all economical shifting was economical revolution, you know, industrial revolution. And today's, I'm not sure why, we use evolution approach. We have a lot of time to offset, to reduction. Why? Maybe we didn't have this time. And the second question is the following. Net zero balance. To strike net zero balance, according to all speeches now, we talk about net zero balance today's, tomorrow, between our action in our future. But how could we strike our net zero balance with our past influences in nature, in environment? What do you think about this? Thank you.
That's a big of a question. Anybody wants to take it?
I can start. So sorry, is the first question, do we have time? So according to the IPCC, the next 8 years are critical, but they do concentrate their recommendations on the reduction side of things. Your question about, you know, the millennia that has taken, you know, it's what I mentioned at the beginning. So our forests and our land, our agricultural soils have been absorbing the emissions of our ongoing activities that haven't changed or have changed marginally, unfortunately, in the last few years. So this has been happening for millennia. And for me, philosophically, now going back to the same land sector to, you know, plant tens of millions of trees that will, again, cancel out the emissions from our ongoing activities is a problematic way of seeing things, for me at least. On the other hand, you know, as has been said by other panelists, you know, again, the next 8 years are critical. We have to move fast. So I think what I would say is that from my own perspective, and to echo what has been discussed in the previous panel, what I find slightly worrying and discouraging is putting a price to CO2 and trying to figure out a market way of, you know, offsetting our way out of this crisis. And although I do believe firmly that it is very important for you know, all sectors to be involved with the transition, and I'm really encouraged to see that there's a lot of appetite to invest in good types of projects that will indeed accelerate that ecosystem restoration. What we're seeing in practice, unfortunately, and we haven't managed to discuss yet specific, you know, project types, is that the projects that are put in place today predominantly, not all of them, but at least most of what I've seen, not only don't manage to achieve, you know, these removals that we've been talking about, but also can harm local biodiversity and human rights. So I do believe that it is important to take a step back and acknowledge that, you know, things are moving really fast indeed, and that we've known about global warming for decades now. And unfortunately, the issue is that we need to move fast now, because that conscience and that understanding of the challenges has increased in recent years. So we have lost a lot of valuable time, but we still have some crucial time ahead of us to put in place these transformative measures. So I've changed completely the answer to your question. I'm not really answering that, but I think we can be hopeful, but we do need to question the approaches that are put forward today.
Do we have any other philosophers on the panel? All right, then we have time for one. Oh, I thought, okay, well, since the microphone is there, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so the first question is, what is your view on the commodification of carbon offsets? Because commodification introduces a radical distancing between the between the material project side and a commodity basically that's being traded globally on the market. So as a commodity user, you would have less appreciation for what is actually the quality and what is the value of that carbon offset project. And the next question then leads to what extent do you think this problem of low additionality and low credibility, a market-related problem, a governance-related problem, or a morality problem?
We're going more and more philosophical here.
So for the commoditization of carbon credits, I think it's a nonsense. Really proposing only credits without seeing the co-benefits and the real projects and the project carriers and all the external partners of the projects is not a good way of incentivizing the companies to really contribute to high quality projects. So all the platforms that are only proposing this kind of credits to speculate and really go fast on the carbon offsetting strategy, I think it's not a good idea. On the ClimateSeed platform, we are really giving the possibility to the companies to see the projects, see the PDD, so the project description documents, download all the certification about the projects. We also have the sustainability committee at ClimateSeed that is double checking the project, so the companies can ask questions directly to the committee. And also we do a double analysis on the co-benefits. So for example, the impact on biodiversity, on the fight against poverty, etc. So commoditization, I really think it's a bad idea, and most of the companies that are using these kind of platforms, I'm thinking of CBL, for example, which is a player in the US. They are most of the time oil and gas companies and coal companies.
I think it's also important to differentiate between offsets and regulatory carbon markets, because regulatory carbon markets, obviously it is a commodity. Like in the EU ETS, carbon is a commodity, but that's the idea of the instrument, right? So we really have to differentiate here.
On your second question, for the CDM or joint implementation credits, those credits are called CERs, Certified Emission Reduction. At ClimateSeed, we do not propose these kind of projects because they lack additionality. So we only propose VERs, Verified Emission Reduction, certified by gold standard of VCS, for example. And I think that the CDM and joint implementation has been stopped. So there is no new issuance of credits today, but only old vintages of credits that can be sold to like companies on the regulated market and use those credits to comply with their rights to pollute. Now there are also discussions to actually link the regulated carbon market with the voluntary carbon market, and to make it possible for oil and gas companies or coal companies to offset part of their rights to pollute to actually comply with their limit. I don't know if it's a good idea, because this will bring a lot of demand on the voluntary carbon market, and there is kind of a shortage today. That's why the prices are going up. So I think this will extend the shortage, and probably there will also be an impact on quality of offset.
I think in this sense there is an example of Colombia, that linked essentially the carbon tax with offsets. So you could reduce your carbon tax burden by purchasing offsets from local projects from sectors not covered by the carbon tax. And that actually did create a lot of demand, and they essentially ran out of projects. I don't know about what happened to the quality of projects. I haven't seen any studies on that, but yeah, it's a valid question. We're coming to an end of our conversation today. I know that there are a few questions that were left unanswered. I will encourage you to continue the conversation over lunch or over coffee. Maybe just before we finish, 1 minute to each of you. What would be your recommendation to our students and participants regarding carbon offsetting? Who wants to go first?
I will. Well, if you want to experiment it, come to JCDecaux. I'm recruiting. We are 12 people in my team, and I'm always looking for very enthusiastic people who want to change the world with us with some concrete actions. We are experimenting a lot, and I think this is a great way to do. Climate is tough. We don't have all the solutions. We have a lot, but we still need to create a lot of them. So I'm very happy to be here, and I hope that you will find each of you some solution, and you will contribute to tackle climate change, either with JCDecaux or another company, obviously. Thank you.
It's a tough one, but I guess I would say, I think it's quite obvious that I'm not a big fan of carbon offsetting. But since the train has left the station, I would say if you are to consider this option, take note of all the literature around land-based offsets, so forest and agriculture, and caution on that. And also, it's really important, I think, to take the do no harm principle seriously, because we've had multiple examples in the past and at present of entire communities in the global south, because that's where you can, implement these huge projects. So communities who have been, exploited, we've had situations of land grabs, exploitation, sorry, I mentioned that before, land grabs, violence, expulsions, you name it. So I think it's important to, be aware of the impacts of these types of projects for local communities in the global south and indigenous communities, and take that do no harm principle to heart, and also think about local ecosystems and biodiversity, and not plant fast-growing industrial monocultural plantations. Thank you.
Lénaïc, you stole my final line. We are also hiring people at ClimateSeed. So if you want to join us, we now, with AXA Investment Manager, have a lot of funds to finance new projects and help our client decarbonize within their own value chain, but also outside of their value chain. I think this is very important because we need to act now, and there is an urgency to do so. So if you want to talk about it, I'm open to questions and open to discuss it.
I think there is lots of fun. There is lots of fun to have on this market, because it's a market which is attracting financial flows. There is a market which is now more and more value driven. So if you want to have fun, I think there is a lot to learn in this area. And I would encourage maybe students who want to enter this market to think about how to differentiate. So how to be different, how to create carbon credits, how to create mechanisms which are different, to go beyond commoditization and to create even more value. And if you want to have more fun, I would also open another door, which is maybe leading to a more complex route, which is what is the future of innovative financing, not on carbon, but on other items. So how do we do to work on financing projects on water? How do we finance projects on biodiversity? How do we work on plastic? How do we work on circularity of packaging and circularity of food? Because I think carbon was maybe the more mature market, but there are other callings. There are others which are very attractive in terms of impact on our ecosystem and in terms of financial benefits. So how do we make sure that we marry both in an innovative way?
Thank you very much. I think it was an excellent debate. Thank you all for participating. Please give it up for our excellent panel.